Welcome to Practical Trouble, where we give you the tools to make the world a better place, one concrete action at a time.
So, Frank, what's our first topic?
It's a double bonus topic, registering to vote and voting. But listen, because we have a twist at the end. So, Lindsay, we know this is like really obvious, but 30% of us do not do it.
Well, there are certain standards that are established for federal elections. The 10th Amendment allows for states to make many of their own voting laws, meaning things vary considerably between states and sometimes even within a state. I'll point out that laws are complicated and often intentionally disproportionately impact people with disabilities, people of color, young people, poor people, the usual. Because voting laws are so different for each state, we won't get into the intricacies. If you go to the National Association of Secretary of State's website, you can find links for your specific state.
Right, and to make things easy, we're going to put the links for anything we mention right in the comments with the video. What do we know about who's registering, and what do we know about who's voting?
More than a quarter of eligible people aren't even registered to vote. That's roughly 63 million people. People registered are disproportionately older, white, married, have a full-time job, and a college degree. And people who are registered show up to vote. In presidential years, it can be as high as 90%. What I think is interesting is if you look at the reasons why folks don't register to vote in the first place. According to a study by the US Census Bureau, for white people, just under half of them say it's because they aren't interested in politics. For people of color, however, that drops down to a little over a quarter. It's a big difference. The other main reasons given for people of color not registering are not believing they're eligible, not meeting registration deadlines, and not knowing where or how to register. So people of color want to register in higher amounts than they do, but they can't for various reasons.
Right, and so that brings up an important point, which is voter suppression is real. And voter suppression doesn't just happen on election day, it starts with the entire registration process. Why might people not be eligible? I thought it was our right as citizens to vote. Well, that gives you one group that's immediately excluded, which is someone who's not a citizen. They're not included in the numbers that Lindsay gave. Although strangely enough, in some local elections, non-citizens may be able to vote. You may not have appropriate identification. Why might you not have identification? Well, there's a financial barrier. Most forms of official ID cost some sort of money. You may not have transportation to get to the place to get your identification. You may not know how to get it. You may have changed your name or moved. A lot of people use their driver's license as their primary identification. So if they're not a driver, they may not have anything. And this disproportionately impacts people of color. It disproportionately impacts the poor. And, different groups are sort of not so subtly weeded out by rules that require strong forms of ID. Another group that's not eligible to vote are people convicted of felonies. Now, this varies dramatically by state. Some are prohibited from voting while they're incarcerated. Some are prohibited from voting until they've discharged all obligations of their conviction, which might include probation or fines. And some people are never allowed to vote ever again if they've been convicted of felony. So again, this disproportionately strikes people of color, particularly Black men, and it's a problem. It's inconsistent across states, and in some cases, it's very, very clearly targeted at minorities. You may not meet the residency requirements. Every jurisdiction seems to have their own residency requirements. Some places it seems like you can just roll up the morning of, declare yourself a resident of the state and go, but you probably should know that before you go to try and vote. Again, people who move a lot are disproportionately impacted by that, so they tend to be young and lower income.
So here is our very first concrete action of the podcast, our first practical action. I'm so excited. Talk to your friends and family about voting. I realize we just talked about registration, but if they aren't voting, they may not be registered. And this shouldn't be a conversation about who you are voting for, rather than if you are voting and how.
If they seem hesitant or reluctant, don't embarrass them, but ask why they don't want to vote. They may think their vote doesn't matter, or that all the candidates are crooks, or that they don't know enough. They probably have a reason that's pretty solid in their own heads. But later on, we'll talk about why they should care about this stuff, and you can use that to try to convince them.
So once you've convinced them that they should vote, what's the first step? If they're not already registered, to help them get registered. Go with them to register. Call the Secretary of State to see what they need. Whatever it takes to help them be comfortable enough with the process to do it. Dealing with the government can be scary for a lot of different reasons. And the rules aren't always clear. Some states allow you to register on election day. Some states require as much as 30 days in advance. Start the process as soon as you can. You don't need to wait for there to be an election upcoming before you register.
And if you're one of those people who the idea of picking up a phone and talking to a government official is terrifying, I understand. We'll put links at the comments for this video of all the other different resources that we've already mentioned and that we will mention that'll help you get there. So if you're more comfortable dealing with a screen, we got you. Okay, so we've talked about registration first because you have to register before you can vote in most states, North Dakota being a notable exception. We want you to understand that your vote is important, but please join us for a little side trip and let's talk about voter suppression and voter discouragement. Suppression is basically creating extra hoops to jump through or putting extra obstacles in the way that are targeted at groups that are likely to vote for the other side. Photo ID, purging voter rolls, limited voting times, limited voting by mail. These are all ways that the government narrows the people who show up. And to give a specific example, Georgia recently restricted early voting to no longer include Sundays because lots of Black churches would organize voting groups after Sunday church.
And that's a good reason for even people who have voted before to confirm that their registration is current. The government cleans or purges the voter rolls every so often. Depending on the state and who's doing it, some might be removed if you haven't voted in the past few elections, if a postcard that got sent to your address got returned, or even if someone with a similar name is registered. Check a few days before the deadline. If you check at 10 p.m. the day registration closes, you won't have time to fix anything that's wrong.
And then beyond voter suppression, we have voter discouragement. That's basically any message that makes it sound like your vote doesn't matter. We're already hearing that the Democrats are going to lose the House and maybe the Senate this year. That's voter discouragement. I promise you, I could commission a poll to show any result that I want, and then I could broadcast that to discourage people from showing up and voting because they're convinced that they're going to lose.
Sometimes we even discourage ourselves. Our vote doesn't matter, the voting process is corrupt, the president's party always loses the House. We have to push back on these ideas in our own heads. One of the things that really bothers me is when people don't vote because they don't like either candidate. There's not just one thing on the ballot. Everything from the president down to school boards, as well as tax measures, constitutional amendments, all sorts of things. Are you telling me you can't stand any candidate and both sides of a ballot measure?
This is a critically important point. All of voter discouragement is aimed at convincing you that your vote doesn't matter, but it does. If it didn't, they wouldn't work so hard to keep you from voting. And if they can convince you to talk yourself out of voting, then you've done their work for them. And to include a trite sports aphorism, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Also, someone is going to win. It's not as if not voting means that suddenly the laws that Congress passes don't apply to you. Low turnout doesn't make the winner any less of a winner. And because so few people vote in the first place, for so many different reasons, even when people do try to find a message in why turnout is low, they can't find the one that you specifically are trying to send. I know we're all sick of voting for the lesser of evils, but the alternative is literally the greater of the evils. I can understand some folks have hard lines about who they'll vote for. So if you really can't bring yourself to vote in a particular race, remember everything else that's on your ballot and then work to have better choices next time.
Don't get ahead of ourselves. Getting better candidates is a whole nother episode. But to that point, one vote decided control of the House of Delegates for Virginia in 2017. They had to pick a name out of a custom-made ceramic bowl. Your vote always has the potential to matter.
All right, so you've got yourself and everyone you know registered to vote. Here comes election day. So here comes your second concrete action. Vote. But here's the big surprise twist.
Dramatic pause.
Make it an event. Take as many people as you can to go vote. Go for coffee, food, drinks afterward, bring donuts, do whatever the law allows to make it interesting and engaging for people around you. Prepare for whatever wait you expect. Bring lawn chairs, snacks, water, umbrellas, whatever you need.
So if voting is so much fun, how come everybody doesn't vote?
This is again from the study by the Census Bureau. So in terms of age, people 18 to 29 are twice as likely to say that they just aren't interested as folks over 65. Strikingly, but not surprisingly, is what percentage say that they are too busy to vote. For folks between 18 and 44, it's right around 1 out of 5 of those registered that say they're too busy. Can you guess what it is for people over 65, Frank?
65 and older, they're kind of retired, they have time on their hands, 10%.
2%. So 1 out of 50 people, 65 and older, say they're too busy to vote, where it's 1 out of 5 for people under 45.
Wow.
That's striking. And that's part of why we have the representation that we do. It's also interesting that white people say they don't vote because they don't like the candidates twice as often as people of color. People of color are more likely to cite inconvenient polling places or transportation problems.
Hey, there's that voter suppression again. All right, so we've talked about the positive things you can do. Register to vote, but also get as many people as possible to vote with you. So do we have a corresponding useless action this week, something that you should not do?
Oh, geez, this is a big one for me. Responding to every political statement online with vote with a whole forest of exclamation points. Yes, we just made voting a practical action, but is screaming into the Twitter void really helping anyone vote? Here's one thing to note. The turnout numbers you hear, like that there was less than 67% turnout in the 2020 presidential election, those are based on the voting age population, not the registered population. Over 91% of people who are registered voted in 2020. So absolutely encourage people to vote. But if you can get them registered first, you've got 63 more million people you can drag to a party with you at the polls on election day.
So there you have it. Your concrete actions are registering to vote and getting everyone you know to register, voting, and the special bonus twist is making a party out of actually voting.
Do it.
So that brings us to the end of our first full episode of Practical Trouble. Let us know what you think in the comments. Like, subscribe, share, friend, send a LinkedIn request, send a barbershop quintet to visit us, whatever works for you.
I think we did great.
All right, I won't argue with that.